we've got the kingdom of heaven represented as several different things. And it's very tempting to look at these as contradictions. But I think actually if you look at it, the kingdom of heaven is not going to be a simple concept, is it? So I guess it can make sense as different facets of the kingdom of heaven, illustrated in different ways. A particularly interesting one today, because this is Matthew chapter 13 from the Gospel of Matthew, but this is where we first encounter Jesus' parables. And certainly my thinking in terms of what I remember is a lot of Jesus' teaching was in parables. But handily, when he announces he's going to do this, the disciples will ask him, why are you going to teach this in parables? And handily, Jesus gives us an answer. Basically, along the lines of, if you're open to it, then the meaning will sit with you and you'll get it and understand it. And if you're closed to it, then you won't. So it sort of keeps things off limits for people who aren't sort of ready or something to hear. So I guess in that respect, so your Richard Dawkins, that sort of thing, it's just going to go straight over their heads. They're not going to want to get it. And your Jordan Petersons, meanwhile, there's depth in it sufficient that you can write books on each of these sort of things, probably, in terms of their depth. I was trying to think, are these basically the same as Aesop's fables? But apparently, no, a fable is different in the sense it's sort of animals are not realistic situations, whereas Jesus' parables are stories told in things they could be literally true, but they're clearly not intended to be literally true, but it's the everyday situation, but with deep and profound meaning. This does all seem to suggest that the disciples are going to understand, but as we've already established, I think, clearly a lot of it they don't understand. So there's clearly some sort of levels where we get that. The first parable, anyway, is the parable of the sower. And handily, Jesus does a really great explanation of what this all means. So basically, it's a farmer who's sowing seeds. And depending on what sort of ground the seeds fall on, depends on what the results are. And Jesus likens each of those to different situations in life. So the first one we've got is the seeds are sown and they fall on the path. And this is basically saying they're not going to root, they're not going to take up, and they're just not going to grow. And Jesus likens this as it's the evil one coming away and stealing away the seeds. So you're sort of sowing seeds that are never going to go anywhere anyway. We then have seeds that fall on rocky ground. So there's a little bit of soil. So they grow fine to start with, but then the sun scorches them and they die. So there's no foundation. And Jesus likens this to someone who initially takes on the message of this and really gets enthusiastic about it. But then the foundation isn't there. So the first sort of shake and they don't work. Very much in my experience doing this, like a Christian who's been a Christian for a long time and very enthusiastic about the New Testament stuff, then picks up the Old Testament for the first time and immediately loses their faith. We then have seeds that are sown among thorns, and the idea is that the thorns and the weeds sort of choke the growth, so just nothing really happens. And Jesus likens these thorns to sort of the worries of life and the deceitfulness of wealth, he says. So all those things that distract, which is basically where I sit, I suppose. Basically just not much is going to happen. We then have the good soil, which Jesus says, well, you sow a seed in good soil and it will yield 30, 60 or even 100 times what was sown. And that's all this super duper wonderful thing. I'm not quite sure how that fits with me because I feel like I understand these and I'm certainly open to and trying to, but it doesn't seem to yield anything in me. But I guess maybe that's just the wrong way of looking at it, because there's no denying that I'm living my life quite differently than I was 3 years ago, maybe just growing up. But I think this does feel like it's part of it. Even just the prospect of it being true is enough to change how you look at life, I find. And I guess I've got this whole body of my work out there in the world for nobody to watch. But maybe that's some sort of yield anyway. We then have the parable of the weeds, which Jesus again explains for us. Really handy when he does this. And this is a wise farmer goes and sows all his seeds in the day and it's all good. But overnight, his enemy comes along and sows weeds amongst the wheat. I mean, what a psycho does that? It's a bit weird. And the farm workers come and ask the farmer, are you just going to yank out the weeds now? And the farmer says no, because if you do that, you'll take up some of the wheat with that. So the answer is to let it all grow. And at harvest time, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, second coming, Judgment Day sort of thing, the weeds can be yanked out and then will be stripped off and burnt, and the good wheat can be taken to God's barn, as it were. A lot of metaphor going on here, but you know, it's a big idea. I think it makes sense in this context at least, and clearly he's at least doing this as a metaphor, saying it's a metaphor. There's an interesting aspect there in the sense that the bad weeds are going to be burned. And in the whole hell debate of whether hell is eternal torture or if it's just annihilation, being burnt would seem to suggest it is just annihilation. And it does seem, you can see where the references are that could lead people to think that hell is going to be perpetual torture. But I don't know, on balance, it seems most of the messaging seems to be suggest that it's not. Jesus anyway goes on to say that the kingdom of heaven is like this. So obviously there's an expectation for us to still spiritually grow, as it were, despite all the bad weeds among us. And then he goes a step further to say that the good wheat are the people of the kingdom, as it were, the people who are going to heaven. And the weeds are the people sort of sown by the evil one, as in the devil, presumably. It doesn't say the devil, but the evil one. It does kind of imply, though, that the weeds are people who are beyond redemption. But the trouble is you can't tell, can you? Because there are some really awful people who have become really great people through some events. And I think it'd be probably fair to say that not all evil people twirl moustaches and try to invade places. So there's really bad people who don't particularly look like bad people. So it's not obvious to tell. So I guess the implication for our point of view is that we have to assume everybody has the potential to be wheat, but we know we have to live in a world where we are surrounded by these weeds and we've got to somehow make that work. He goes on to say that the harvest will be the end of the age, i.e. Judgment Day. And very interestingly, it will be the angels who pull up the stuff and harvest it and who do the separating anyway. But presumably God's got to decide that because we know that only God knows what's in the heart. So the angels won't know that unless God tells them. So I guess they're more the sort of instruments of his thing. But again, I don't know if that's just a metaphor anyway. It sort of implies, though, that we should be able to recognise that difference between weeds and not. I don't think it necessarily intends to do that because, as I said, not all bad people look like bad people and a lot of really bad people turn out to be really good people in the end. So, yeah, it's an interesting way. I guess that's the problem with metaphor, isn't it? You sort of, if you read it in the wrong direction, you imply something that perhaps isn't intended to be in there. We then have the parable of the mustard seed, which is very short. And Jesus just talks about a mustard seed is really teeny and then you plant it, and it turns into something quite big. I did Google this to check, and it seems that a mustard plant will grow somewhere between 2 feet and 10 feet tall. So, really small seed, really big plant. Yeah, fair enough. That seems to be the whole message there, other than saying that the kingdom of heaven is like this seed. We then have the parable of the yeast, which is also very small, as in a parable. And it's talking about you add a small amount of yeast to 30 kilograms of flour, and it completely changes the outcome of what you end up with. Obviously, puffing up and all the rest of it. So this is also like the kingdom of heaven, yeast, which is interesting because in the Old Testament, yeast was the devil, wasn't it? It was a bit of a, I don't think we've heard much about it in between there, but it's an interesting idea. We then have the parable of the hidden treasure, where a man finds treasure in a field and then goes and sells everything he owns in order to buy this field. And then the idea is that the kingdom of heaven is like this treasure and that it should be the most important thing in the world to us and that we should be giving everything else up basically in pursuit of this treasure. We then have the parable of the pearl, which is sort of similar to the parable of the treasure, but different because it's not the pearl that's the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like the merchant looking for the pearl, who then finds it and sells everything in order to acquire it. So it's an interesting difference in terms of how the kingdom of heaven is represented there, which we'll come back to in a second. We then have the parable of the net, this is the last one. And the net is like you cast the net over the side, you pull in all the fish, and then someone has to go and sort out, or the fisherman goes and sorts out the good fish from the bad at the end. And the kingdom of heaven is like that net. That's it with the parables for now, but it notes here also that Jesus, teaching in his own hometown, doesn't go down very well, which is interesting. I guess there's that idea that if you know someone as something and then suddenly they become much bigger and different, you can't help but see them as they were, perhaps, or some extent. And there's an interesting idea in there because we don't know anything about what happened with Jesus. He was born in this story, and then next thing we know, he's 30-ish or something like that. And interesting that there are references to Jesus when he was younger. I think it's the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is confusingly different to the Gospel of Thomas, which I don't have anyway. Apparently, it's even referenced in the Quran. To the extent that the Quran in English is still the Quran. But there was a story about Jesus making birds out of clay and then breathing life into them. They turn to real birds and flutter off. But it failed the test to be held as proper scripture for various reasons, which is kind of interesting, I guess, isn't it? But Because you think maybe the church would want to have a story in there about Jesus being all miraculous when he was young and not have that 30-year gap or whatever it was. But yeah, that's quite an interesting one. So to conclude, we've got the kingdom of heaven represented as several different things. And it's very tempting to look at these as contradictions. But I think actually if you look at it, the kingdom of heaven is not going to be a simple concept, is it? So I guess it can make sense as different facets of the kingdom of heaven illustrated in different ways. But anyway, the different aspects we have are the kingdom of heaven can be characterised as a wise farmer who allows weeds to grow, recognising that doing that protects the good seed by not yanking out the weeds early. Also characterised as a small seed that becomes a large plant. Characterised also as a small ingredient that transforms the whole recipe. Also as hidden treasure, but also as the person who puts that treasure as the highest priority in their life. And finally as a net that catches all and then needs sorting out. It's all very nicely done, that, isn't it? It makes clear it is a metaphor, which is really useful after reading the Old Testament, and then covers several different aspects in very clever, short sort of ways. I don't think it doesn't prove anything, obviously. I mean, I'm sure there are people who can write stuff as clever as this. Obviously, it was written by, well, I suppose, no, because they're just saying what Jesus did. But even if you didn't believe this stuff is actually true, you can't help but look at the Bible and go, well, it's a genius work of writing either way. And the fact it's so coherent over thousands of years, or 1,000-ish years or so, is quite amazing. But yeah, anyway, on we shall go and see what's next.